At 83 years old, Abe Livingston said he had done well in slavery. It was not irony and it was not praise. It was the language of a man shaped entirely inside a system that never allowed comparison. Born enslaved in eastern Texas, Abe grew up under constant supervision, working from childhood, sharing daily life with the enslavers' children, and reaching adulthood before freedom ever had meaning. His testimony does not soften slavery. It reveals how domination could normalize itself so deeply that survival was mistaken for well-being. Abe Livingston was born enslaved in Jasper County, Texas, on the property of Luke Hadnot, a planter who held roughly 60 to 70 enslaved people. From his earliest years, his world was organized by the plantation's rules, where he could stand, when he could speak, what he could eat, and what kind of work his body was considered ready to perform. Childhood did not remove him from labor. It only changed the size of the tasks. While he was still small, Abe's work stayed close to the daily mechanics that kept the place running. He carried water out to the field hands, sometimes hauling a barrel on a slide, and he learned to manage animals long before he could claim any control over his own life. He watched turkeys and tried to keep hawks off them. He handled a mule when he was just about big enough, using growth as a measure of usefulness rather than as a protected stage of life. Abe also grew up in unusual proximity to Hadnot's sons. He played games and sang rhymes with them, even when the meanings of their lives could not have been more different. In the big house, access to food came through scraps. After the white family ate, what remained was passed down. When conflict flared inside the enslaved quarters, Abe sometimes ran to the main house rather than return to the cabin. He described doing that after his father beat him, which shows how violence could be recycled inside the enslaved community, shaped by the pressure and control imposed from above. The plantation's hierarchy was visible in every small detail. Abe could share a moment of play with white children, yet he could not decide where he slept, how long he stayed away, or what happened to him when adults were angry. Even meals carried a lesson. The order of eating signaled the order of human worth. The kitchen fed him, but only after others were satisfied. By the time the war broke out, Abe was big enough to be trusted with animals and field support, but still treated as a child when it suited the owner's control. The boundary between boyhood and manhood was not marked by choice. It was marked by the moment someone decided his body could carry more weight. As Abe grew older, he and other boys sometimes went into the woods and stayed out all night, but not always with the white boys, who couldn't, as he put it. They built campfires and watched for witches and haints. Abe recalled seeing something near a waterhole, including a tall white haint that appeared repeatedly, yet he said he never got close because he was too scared. Whether the figure was real or imagined mattered less than what the memory reveals. A child trained to scan the dark for danger as naturally as he scanned the day for commands. Older boys used the night to test the younger ones. Abe described how the rougher boys would slip away from the fearful ones, let them believe they were lost, and then make ghost noises in the trees, or sneak up in the dark and imitate an animal. Even the tools of safety were unequal. Abe remembered the white boys carrying a compass so they would not get lost. The stories told at the fire carried lessons too. Abe remembered a tale about a deer racing a turtle, and another about a bear outsmarting dogs by running near a beehive so the dogs would be stung. On a plantation, that kind of story was more than entertainment. It was a way to speak about trickery, endurance, and survival, without openly naming the human predators that surrounded them. Before the war, Abe's family was already tied to the wider machinery of conflict. His father served as a servant in the army and helped dig defensive earthworks around Mansfield. Abe, still young, stayed bound to the plantation's rhythm. The coming war did not arrive to him as politics or speeches. It arrived as disruption, labor demands, and the knowledge that armed men and distant decisions could reshape a life that had never been allowed to choose. As the Civil War reached the interior of eastern Texas, its presence was felt less through battles and more through disruption. Authority on the plantation remained, but certainty weakened. Men were pulled away for military service. Supply lines faltered. Rumors moved faster than explanations. For someone like Abe Livingston, the war was not a political struggle or a moral reckoning. It was a period when familiar routines became unstable without being replaced by anything intelligible. Abe was already performing steady labor when the war escalated. He was no longer shielded by youth, yet still excluded from understanding decisions that determined his future. He knew that his father had been taken into military service as a servant and that earthworks were being built near Mansfield, but these facts arrived without context. The war existed around him as noise, movement and absence, not as cause or consequence. The end of slavery did not come through a single defining moment. It arrived first as a message. On a Tuesday morning, sometime between 9 and 10 o'clock, word spread that bondage was over. There were no speeches, no written orders explained to the enslaved population, and no guidance on what should happen next. Most people simply went back to their cabins and waited. For several days, nothing changed except the uncertainty. When Union soldiers finally appeared, their presence contradicted later narratives of liberation. They entered the region in large numbers, moving in from the east after crossing the Sabine River. Abe remembered them as loud, relaxed, and focused almost entirely on food and animals. Horses were taken without discussion. Livestock was slaughtered and consumed. Dozens of large turkeys disappeared in a single visit, followed by hogs and cattle. Their authority was unquestioned, but it did not resemble protection or assistance. Some young men chose to leave with the soldiers when they moved on. Most remained behind, not because of loyalty, but because they had nowhere to go. Freedom had been announced, but no infrastructure followed it. There were no wages waiting, no land distribution, no explanation of rights, and no path forward. The plantation system had collapsed, but its absence created a vacuum rather than an opportunity. Eventually, Abe left Jasper County and traveled to Jefferson County. There he entered railroad labor, performing physically demanding work that required endurance rather than skill advancement. He later turned to farming. These transitions were not described as advancement or independence. They were continuations of labor under different ownership structures. Work remained central. Survival remained the goal. What stands out in Abe Livingston's account is his repeated assertion that freedom didn't mean much because he didn't know the difference. This was not indifference. It was the outcome of a lifetime without comparison. When every stage of existence has been controlled, the removal of control does not automatically create agency. Choice is meaningless if no one has ever been taught how to use it. Years after emancipation, Abe still moved between old locations and old relationships. He returned to Jasper County, interacted with former members of the Hadnot family, and described those interactions as cordial. Legal ownership was gone, but social memory remained intact. The past did not disappear. It settled. By the time Abe was interviewed in old age, he was still working outdoors, still active, still dressed in worn clothing patched together over decades. His post-war life was not marked by dramatic transformation. It was marked by continuity. Labor replaced labor. Authority softened but never vanished. The system ended, but its imprint remained embedded in how freedom itself was understood. When Abe Livingston spoke about his life in old age, his words did not follow the arc expected by later generations. He did not frame his experiences around outrage, redemption, or triumph. Instead, he spoke with calm familiarity, describing his past as something endured rather than judged. That calmness itself is the most revealing element of his testimony. Abe's statements were recorded during a period when former enslaved people were being interviewed not to shape national policy, but to preserve memories that were already fading. By the time his account was documented, the legal structure that had defined his early life was gone, yet the social order that replaced it had done little to elevate those who survived it. His recollections were not shaped for an audience seeking moral clarity. They were shaped by habit, memory, and a lifetime spent adapting to authority. What Abe described was not the absence of cruelty, but the normalization of it. He spoke of having done well, not because conditions were humane, but because survival had been possible. In a system where death, sale, and punishment were constant threats, endurance itself became the measure of success. His language reflects a psychology formed under coercion, where comparison was impossible and expectation was deliberately limited. The most striking feature of Abe Livingston's testimony is what it does not contain. There is no language of entitlement. There is no expectation that freedom should have produced comfort, wealth, or security. His account lacks anger. not because harm was absent, but because harm had been continuous. When suffering is uninterrupted, it stops being named. It becomes environment. Abe's memory also exposes how slavery extended beyond legal ownership. Even decades after emancipation, the framework through which he understood work, authority, and self-worth remained intact. He evaluated his life through productivity, obedience, and familiarity rather than autonomy. This was not a personal failure, it was a systemic outcome. Slavery was designed not only to extract labor, but to shape perception so completely that its absence would feel undefined. His testimony complicates modern narratives that rely on clear divisions between oppression and liberation. Abe Livingston's life does not offer a dramatic before and after. It offers continuity. The same body that had worked under compulsion continued working under necessity. The same relationships, stripped of legal ownership, persisted socially. The same land, the same routines, and the same hierarchies remained visible, even if renamed. For historians, Abe's account is uncomfortable precisely because it resists simplification. It cannot be used easily as propaganda for benevolence, nor can it be reduced to a story of awakening. It forces acknowledgement of a deeper truth, that systems of domination do not end cleanly, and that their greatest success lies in how thoroughly they condition those trapped inside them. Abe Livingston did not present himself as a symbol. He presented himself as a man who survived according to the rules imposed on him and adapted when those rules shifted without explanation. His life stands as evidence that the damage of slavery cannot be measured only by chains or laws, but by the long silence it leaves inside those who lived through it. Abe Livingston's account survives not because it fit a heroic narrative, but because it resisted one. It entered the historical record quietly, preserved among hundreds of testimonies that were never meant to challenge power, only to be archived before disappearing. What gives his words weight is not what they condemn, but what they expose without accusation. His testimony forces a reconsideration of how history evaluates truth. Traditional accounts favor rupture, rebellion, escape, victory, transformation. Abe offered none of that. He offered continuity. That alone makes his voice dangerous to simplified storytelling. It shows that systems can end on paper, while continuing in minds, habits, and expectations long after laws change. For researchers, Abe Livingston becomes a case study in how domination reproduces itself beyond force. His language reveals how authority teaches people to measure life by stability rather than justice, by familiarity rather than dignity. This is not submission. It is adaptation under conditions where resistance carried costs few could survive. History often praises defiance. Abe's life documents endurance, which is harder to classify and easier to ignore. There is also a structural silence surrounding testimonies like his. They are quoted selectively, often stripped of context, or dismissed as evidence that slavery was not always brutal. That misuse says more about modern discomfort than about the past. Abe never claimed the system was kind. He described how it trained people to accept its logic. That distinction matters. What remains unsettling is how easily his account mirrors other systems that followed. Sharecropping, railroad labor, tenant farming, and later industrial work reused the same measurements of worth: output, obedience, and reliability. Freedom altered legal status, but it did not redesign the economic terrain. Abe's life did not end in chains, but it never entered security either. This is where the testimony reaches beyond biography. Abe Livingston represents a category history struggles to place. Individuals who survived total control so completely that survival itself became the standard. He is neither a symbol of benevolence nor a symbol of revolt. He is evidence of how thoroughly a system can succeed when it does not need to be defended anymore. The final hook is not moral outrage, it is recognition. If a man can live through bondage, war, emancipation, and decades of labor and still say he did well, the question is not whether slavery was cruel. The question is how many people were trained so effectively that cruelty no longer required explanation. Abe Livingston does not ask to be believed. He simply stands in the record, forcing anyone who reads him to confront an uncomfortable truth, The most powerful systems do not rely on violence alone. They rely on shaping what people come to accept as normal. That is why his voice still matters. Livingston lived inside a system that never asked him to understand freedom, only to endure. Not through rebellion, not through escape, but through adaptation so complete that survival itself became the measure of success. His life was not shaped by choice, but by what the system allowed him to believe was normal. His story isn't comfortable, and it isn't meant to be. It doesn't offer heroes or villains in neat positions. It shows something far more disturbing, how a system can last long enough to reshape how people define a good life. These are the stories history rarely highlights, not because they don't matter, but because they challenge easy conclusions. If you believe testimonies like this deserve to be heard, help make sure they're not buried again. Like the video, share it, and subscribe to the Slave Revolt for more true stories that history tried to smooth over or erase. Who should be featured in the next episode? Leave the name in the comments. Every time one of these stories is shared, the record becomes harder to distort. I'll see you in the next video.